Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to a special conversation today with a very special woman. Her name is Diante Fuchs. She is a psychologist, clinical psychologist, and she's the author of the brand new book, The Gift of Anxiety: Harnessing the Ease Method to Turn Stuck Anxiety into Your Greatest Ally. And it's been an absolute pleasure to work with you on this book, Dee. And the number one feedback we've gotten on it so far is I heard the title, The Gift of Anxiety, and I didn't believe it. It sounded like BS. It sounded like marketing hyperbole. Like there's no way anxiety could be a gift because it's been so painful and hard to deal with in my life. And then they read the book and it totally changed their perspective. And I know you were trained as a clinical psychologist, to treat anxiety as a mental illness or a disorder. And that wasn't working for you for 10 years in your practice. So you can tell us a little bit about that. What were your struggles with working with anxiety and how did your perspective change?
Yeah, amazing. Um, I think when you study psychology and when you do your master's degree and all throughout your training, we're really looking at the different ways in which people can experience mental health conditions as problems. So we're identifying them as diagnoses or disorders, and then we're labeling them, and then we're trying to treat that and seeing it as a big problem that this person needs to like heal from or get cured of. So in the beginning of my practice, when I was working with people, of course, I get referrals for all sorts of conditions and mental health struggles, anxiety being one of them. And what I found was that this was the group of people that I struggled the most with because no matter how many strategies I'd try and help them with, like the relaxation training that we were taught to use, the cognitive behavior therapy, even the mindfulness-based strategies, they would come back week after week and they would still have a level of anxiety. We're geared towards helping people find out what are the areas of their lives that are not serving them or not working for them that might be causing more of that particular experience, whether it be anxiety or depression or any other struggle that they're having. So, of course, I do the work in identifying that with them. But even when those problems were solved, they'd still be struggling with anxiety. Not everybody, but a large group of people would still be stuck. And it is kind of through that work, and then, of course, the experience with my husband, that I began to realize that there's this tiny element that we're not seeing, and it's the fear of the anxiety itself that stays there. So even though we're working at identifying the problems and then solving those in that person's life, giving them the relaxation strategies, changing their thoughts, if they're still afraid of anxiety in itself, they remain anxious. And so that was the piece that we needed to learn how to shift. And it's only when you begin to realize that all of these emotional responses that we're having are actually there for a reason. We feel anxious for a reason. We feel sad for a reason. We feel grief or angry for reasons. So to then begin labeling those as problems that we shouldn't feel is counterintuitive. Of course, they can get big and loud and intrusive and debilitating, which is what people with anxiety disorders would say has happened for themselves. But as you'll see in the book, and this is where all of my work has kind of looked at, is identifying that emotional response that was there to serve you hasn't been able to do its job, and that's why it's become loud and intrusive and debilitating.
So what is anxiety's job? Like what is its function? Why do we have it? What is
Yeah.
it trying to do?
Yeah, the sole purpose of anxiety is to get you to pay attention. It is just an alarm. And fair, it is a very basic rudimentary alarm system. It doesn't have sort of the capacity for abstract thoughts or to evaluate its alarm system against the reality. It just sees a threat and it alarms you. End of story. And sometimes that threat can be real, like it could be a real thing in your life that is causing you stress and potentially a threat to your survival. Or it could just be something that you're feeling or thinking or imagining, and then that becomes the threat. But all that anxiety is getting you to pay attention to that thing that it believes is a threat to your survival, beginning and the end of it.
Gotcha. So anxiety is there to alert us to a threat. Then how does that become a disorder? How does that become so debilitating that people can't go outside, they can't go spend time with their kids, they can't go to fulfill their job duties?
Yeah. So when it first rings the alarm bells, most people don't really acknowledge it as that. So you might find that when you first become anxious, you don't really feel the emotional state of nervousness. You probably have maybe some heart palpitations that kind of came out of nowhere, or suddenly you're not sleeping well. And then maybe there's some chest pain and headaches, persistent sort of muscle tension. Those are the general signs of anxiety that people term stress, and they brush aside and they say, well, if I just soldier on with this, or if I can just get to my summer holiday, I'll be okay. and they kind of ignore it, right? So that's the alarm that's asking you to pay attention. But if you don't pay attention, the alarm has to get louder and louder and louder, because anxiety has to serve its purpose, which is getting you to pay that attention. So now potentially that heart palpitation turns into a racing heart, and maybe even eventually we land up with a panic attack. It just depends on each person what kind of experience they're going to have with the anxiety and how it intensifies and gets loud. But at the end of the day, it's going to keep on ringing those bells in whichever way it can to get you to pay attention. So that's when it becomes really loud and intrusive. Now, most people, when they have that really intense experience of anxiety, that's when they suddenly stop to look. But instead of saying, oh, wow, I'm really anxious, I wonder what I need to pay attention to, what's not serving me, we now immediately flip into the script that says, this anxiety is a problem and I must get rid of it. And so now we already start the trajectory, I guess, of fear of the anxiety response. So then people go to the doctor, and the doctor also says, oh, you're anxious, take these medications, and then we can get the anxiety to go away. And so everybody's now, I guess, colluding with the idea that the anxiety is a problem that we need to get rid of. So it just perpetuates the anxiety about anxiety. And that's where it gets stuck.
Okay, so it's kind of like we're at war with anxiety. So initially it pops up, something issue in our life, and we have heart palpitations or we feel really stressed. But you're saying the purpose is to pay, the idea is to pay attention to the anxiety. But I think a lot of people who are suffering from anxiety would say, well, I am paying attention to it. Like I can't take my mind off it. So how do we pay attention to anxiety in a way that actually helps us instead of gets us stuck?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I teach most of my clients is that there are actually these three parts to anxiety, right? So the first part is the very initial bell ringing or the alarm ringing that the anxiety was asking you to pay attention to. So maybe that was something that you were avoiding. Maybe there was a trauma that was being triggered in your daily life, or maybe you were just burnt out and stressed and not paying much attention to your self-care. So that's where that stress originates, and that's the root cause. But by the time people are in the space where they're looking for help with anxiety and they're always focusing on it, it's the only thing that they can think about and feel, this is where the anxiety has become stuck on itself, as I like to call it. So this is where we're now anxious about being anxious. So we're afraid of having another panic attack. We're afraid of what the anxiety is doing to us. We don't want to have anxiety in public. So that is where it becomes the sole focus. But we've forgotten that there was this original root cause. In this space, absolutely, people are only focusing on the anxiety and the symptoms, and that is all they can fear and feel. But the more they fear and feel it, the more of it perpetuates. So this is where it's pretty stuck. Now, if we can see the anxiety in a different way while we're in this part of the anxiety, if we can start to see it as, oh, wow, this is an alarm system that has, I guess, got stuck on itself, or maybe it's short circuiting and it just keeps on ringing the alarms. What do we need to do to start paying attention to what's happening here? So while people are paying attention to the symptoms and the fact that they're anxious, what I'm asking them to do is let that part of it go, and let's go back to understanding why anxiety came up in the first place. What are the parts of your life here that are not serving you? Because when you start addressing those, while at the same time just allowing that alarm bell to go, that's when you're going to start kind of reducing the signals of the alarm, because you're finally paying attention. And when you shift what is not serving you, the anxiety doesn't have to alarm you anymore. The third part of this is that your central nervous system does get a bit strung out with anxiety, right? So that's when we kind of have nervous system burnout, and a lot of the symptoms of that can look a lot like anxiety as well, or at least they feed into each other. So part of the process is also, doing the relaxation strategies, the vagus nerve toning, the breathing techniques that are going to help your central nervous system just to relax and calm down while you listen to the anxiety and pay attention to the root cause.
Gotcha. So what you're saying is there's some kind of root cause of anxiety, and if we address that, that'll go a long way, or that will solve all of anxiety. How does that work?
Well, I guess it's not going to solve all of anxiety. The aim is not to get rid of anxiety, right? Like it's a natural emotional response. You're going to have times of it coming up. What we want to do is change our response to the anxiety. So if we can get to a point where it's not a frightening experience, and largely when you can understand why you're feeling anxious, then it doesn't feel like, oh my gosh, I've got a disorder, I'm sick, I'm mentally ill, which generates more fear. So that part of understanding the root cause not only helps us address the real problem, but it also empowers us to feel a little bit more like, oh, this makes sense, and I don't have to be afraid of this. So that changes the response. Now, when you have anxiety in the future, which you will have because you're a human, every time, if we can just respond to that anxiety with compassion and understanding rather than more fear and more anxiety, you're going to move through that process a whole lot quicker than getting stuck with it for years or months or however long you're being stuck with it. If that makes sense?
Gotcha. So you're saying anxiety is just normal emotion. Everyone feels anxiety. It's gonna pop up from time to time because that's part of our normal alert system
Yeah.
that we're a living creature and there's some kind of threat that we have to figure out in our environment, right? So you give a good example in the book of, I've got a big work meeting tomorrow. My boss asked me to meet with some people. I don't know what it's about. I'm feeling anxious. I need to like, is my suit ready? And then I go and get my suit ready, and like, oh, I feel better. And then, oh my gosh, like, did I prepare the documents I need? And I go, get to the computer and prepare the documents I need, and then I feel better. So is that how anxiety functions? Like it pops up, it alerts us we need to do something, and then we do the thing, and then anxiety goes away. Is that how it's supposed to be? And is
Yeah.
that the healthy way that we experience anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, I'm describing the two various types of anxiety, right? There's ordinary anxiety, which is what you're describing. And then there's the stuck anxiety, which is where most people would be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. So once you've shifted your stuck anxiety back to ordinary, and in the future, as it's going to pop up as those ordinary alarms, that's exactly what it does. For the smaller things like, going for a meeting with your boss, which is not necessarily a huge threat to your survival, but if you don't get that meeting right, then they're going to perceive you in a particular way, and maybe that's a negative thing, and we don't know what that holds for us in terms of our job progress. So in a way, it is a little threat to your survival, but not really so. So it's going to be a small amount of anxiety or nervousness that you're going to feel around making sure that you prepare well for the meeting and you're organized and you've got what you need to get to that meeting on time, right? So each time that it pops up, if you address what it's asking you to pay attention to, it will subside every single time. But you might find that there might be a bigger event in your life. Like, for example, relocating to another city or to another town, and you've got to drag your whole family and your kids, and you've got to get them into new schools, and you've got to start a new job, and you've got to make new friends, find a home. These are big things. And of course, they're in the future, they're uncertain, they're out of our control. Anxiety is going to ask you to pay attention to all of them because we're coming at it from a belief that if it doesn't go well, then it's bad for us, right? And it's that or else, or the bad for us, that anxiety will see as being the threat to your survival. So potentially those alarm bells are going to be a little bigger and a little louder than just trying to figure out what you're wearing for your meeting tomorrow. So it's all going to be relative, but all of the time, if we can just stop and say, okay, I'm anxious. What is it that I'm anxious about? What is anxiety asking me to pay attention to? And the biggest clue is always going to be if you ask yourself, what is my what if question? Like, what if I am late for the meeting? What if I don't find a good school for my kids? That what if question is going to alert you to what it is that you're asking to pay attention to. In the case of stuck anxiety, your what if question is always going to be, what if I get anxious? What if I have a panic attack? What if these symptoms mean something worse? It's always going to be about the anxiety. In ordinary anxiety, the what if question is about the external event that anxiety is asking you to pay attention to.
Gotcha. So I can definitely relate to that. My mind comes up with what if questions all the time. Like,
Yeah.
what if the mic doesn't work in this interview? What if, right? So you're saying that's normal and healthy and totally like helping us kind of navigate the world and solve problems. If I'm asking, questions about, what if my technology doesn't work for this interview? That's normal. But then if I'm asking, like, what's an example of where it's no longer serving us, those kind of what if questions?
Yeah. So I guess, again, there's an element always of us wanting to make sure that everything is going perfectly and well. And that's going to be about our beliefs around how much we feel like we can cope with and deal with. So someone who has a growth mindset or is really resilient might sort of not worry about whether the mic is going to work in the interview, right? Or if it comes up, they'll be like, well, if it doesn't, we'll deal with it. It's a very different response type to somebody who's like has a belief that if it doesn't go well, that means something about me, or I'm not going to be good enough. So depending on what we're saying to ourselves about the outcome is also going to depict how much anxiety you experience in that moment, right? But always, what if questions are relatively normal. When we get into a space where we are literally what ifing every single outcome that we're about to go into, that's when we're in a way trying to, I guess, habitually make the future something that we can control. And there is something about realizing that there isn't so much about the future that we can control. when we can develop a better belief around how we're able to deal with difficult situations, thinking about in your entire life how many things have gone wrong, because I can guarantee there have been plenty, and you've dealt with every single one of them. You didn't walk out of them thinking, well, that was fab, but you dealt with it. So if we can use all that evidence to build up a belief that says, if this thing doesn't go according to plan, I'll deal with it. It removes so much of the anxiety that you might feel, because anxiety is always about the threat to survival. So again, it depends on what your beliefs are about yourself and how much you can deal with. That's going to also depend how much anxiety you'll end up experiencing in your life, right?
Gotcha. So it sounds like all of us have this context of how we approach situations, like a work situation, right? And if we have a belief that if something goes wrong, I need to make sure I'm prepared. I have to control everything. I have to prepare for every eventuality and make sure I get everything just right ahead of time, or else something really bad's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so if that's my belief system, that I have to get everything just right, then I'm going to be really anxious or really stressed because I'm trying to control all these things that in reality I can't control every situation, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So what I always think is a really good measure of this is any time that you're telling yourself that you must do something or I should do something, that must comes with an or else. I must do this or else. You're not actually following through with what that or else is saying, but it implies that something terrible will happen to you. And that's what generates anxiety. So if we're saying, I must get this right, or what? Right? And it's that or what that generates anxiety. Whereas if we just change that to saying, I'd really like to get this right, already it removes so much of the pressure and, of course, the anxiety that comes with it.
Gotcha. So it sounds like there's this belief that if I don't do this thing in a certain way, really bad stuff's gonna happen.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm not conscious of that going into it. I'm just asking these, like, I'm just aware that my mind is like, oh my God, what if I'm not ready for this inning? What if I need to do this? What if I need to do that? And I'm maybe not aware of these deeper kind of beliefs that I have
Yeah.
and that kind of deeper belief is what's causing me to perceive the situation as so threatening and scary and painful.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess we can sort of begin to touch on those by identifying how many what if questions we're asking about a particular sort of topic. If you get a bit more, I guess, aware or asking yourself, what am I thinking in this moment? You're going to start seeing a theme arise around the thoughts that you're having. So if the belief is I'm not good enough, then often you'll find beliefs like, what if they judge me negatively? What if I've got nothing to say? What if the interview goes really badly? So we're consistently questioning ourselves about our performance and how people are going to see us. Those what if questions are going to alert you to the belief that you have about yourself that potentially you're not good enough, right? And we can do this across the board because the amount of thoughts that you have over time are going to show you a theme of what it is that you believe about yourself. Yeah.
Gotcha. So by paying attention to our own patterns, our own thoughts, our own experiences, and then kind of being conscious or maybe journaling about these what if questions,
Yeah.
then we can start to see what our patterns are,
Yeah.
and then we can start to shift the pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other really cool strategy, which you can use anytime, is if you are asking yourself, what if the microphone doesn't work during the interview, then just answer the question. Okay, so what then? Because we often don't answer that question. So it leaves the outcome hanging as this black abyss of something that we must avoid at all costs. But if you just go ahead and answer it, okay, if the microphone doesn't work during the interview, what then? We'll reschedule the interview. I'll figure out a new microphone. Like very quickly, you come to realize that you actually do have resources to deal with that outcome and that it's not a life or death situation, which then immediately removes the anxiety again.
Gotcha. So we can actually answer the questions for ourselves, get really specific. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because I think we all kind of know that this kind of big unknown thing in the future, like moving to a new city, like all the what if questions, like there's a lot of unknowns. But once we start to address the unknowns of, oh, I'm gonna live in this house in this area, and I'm gonna, have this job. Once you start to answer those questions, you shrink that giant thing to be afraid of to like very specific things that aren't as scary.
Yeah. Yeah. And also just looking into, because I think most of us want to avoid the idea of the discomfort that will come with the unwanted outcome. We want to just avoid the idea that the interview will be a fail or that the move won't go smoothly, because it feels uncomfortable to imagine that outcome. So that's why we stay away from it. But if you can just feel into the possibility of that thing happening, the thing that you're so desperate to avoid, feel into what that might look like if it did actually happen. And then you begin to realize that actually you have the resources that you need to cope with it. Because everybody who is struggling with anxiety, and even in the moments where we're having ordinary anxiety, at the very core of it, there is a tenet that says, if this happens, I won't cope. That's it. That's the be all and end of it. So if we can change that belief of saying, I'm not going to cope with this, to, okay, actually, it'll suck. It's not ideal, but actually, I'll deal with it. There's a very different outcome in terms of how we feel. Of course, never are we going to look at an unwanted outcome and go, I welcome that. I love that in my life. You're not expected to do that. But at least we want to move from that must not happen because I will not cope with it to, okay, I'm going to work hard at that not happening. But if it does, I'll deal with it in this way.
Okay, so so I just had this idea coming as you're saying that is almost like I'm threatening myself. It's like if I move to the city and it doesn't go the way I want, like there's this kind of like ambiguous, like the world's gonna end, or I'm not gonna be able to cope, or it's just gonna be overwhelming, and it's almost like internally I'm threatening myself with this really bad outcome, and then that's what's making me feel so upset and so overwhelmed by the situation.
Exactly right. Spot on. Spot on. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so how do I stop doing that then? Like if I'm noticed that I have anxiety about situations in the future, it feels overwhelming, it feels really stressful, then how do we shift that pattern? How do we make it so that we're not stuck in that loop? Because it's easy to say, oh, like here's my pattern, I do this thing. Like I think a lot of people with anxiety, they know, yeah, like I do this thing, I have like they're not like unaware that they have anxiety, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of people too, like they search for help in so many different ways. So like how do you actually begin to address that and turn that around?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, unfortunately, we're the product of society, which has in some ways led us to believe that our minds control us. Like we're this human being with this body and these organs, and then we have this operating center that controls us, right? And so we've kind of left the realm of the mind to this place where we believe we can't really change it or control it or have any access to it. And that's kind of how we grow up. So children are not taught that they can control their minds the same way that they can control their muscles. At school, we're focusing on physical activity, PE. And then when you grow up, you're told that you need to exercise your body and eat healthy and look after your organs. No one's talking about your mind. The truth is that your brain and your mind are as much a part of your body as your lungs and your stomach are, right? So you actually do have control over it as much as you do the muscles in your body. But because you've been led to believe that you don't, you've kind of left it to its own devices, and it just runs rampant. And we're always going to, the brain is incredible, right? It works on the most basic systems to keep your survival going and to restore energy. So it works on what we call a rewards-based learning. Anytime that you do something that brings you mild relief, just the tiniest bit of relief, your brain's going to store that action as something to be repeated next time. So that's how we form habits. Now, habits are not just biting my nails or smoking cigarettes. Habits can also be our habitual thinking, the way we perceive something, the thing that we think about it. What ifing and worrying about outcomes becomes a habit because there's something about that future outcome that you can't control. But if you prep it, if you imagine every possible worst outcome, then that feels like you're doing something about it, like you're trying to control it somehow just by thinking about it. And so that's the habitual act that we then go into. Now, we can get our control of that in the same way as you can decide, right, I want bigger biceps, so I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week. I'm going to start working out on my muscles, right? If we could have that same level of, what's the word, consistency and of focus with our minds, we could change those thought patterns just as much as we can change our bodies. So the idea is to recognize the pattern. People can go, yeah, I've got this pattern. Okay, so now what are you going to do about it? Every time that you find yourself going down that thought pattern, you have to stop it. You have to say to yourself, there's my anxiety worrying about the future outcome that I cannot control. Actually, I have everything that I need to deal with difficult situations. Actually, I can do hard things. So saying that to yourself over and over and over lands up creating a new way of responding, a new automatic pattern. Because over time, every time you tell yourself, actually, it sucks, but I can deal with it, That's a much better feeling than, oh my gosh, if this does not go well, the world is going to crumble in on me. The brain is going to recognize the better feeling of, I can deal with this. And then it will slowly start to create that as your new habitual way of being. So it really just takes repetition, consistency, and as much work as you would on your body, on your mind, for you to get control of it.
Gotcha. So it's like we got to go to the gym
Yeah.
and work on our mind, work on our thoughts, work on our habits. So, but like, if you were to tell someone that they who had not worked on their body at all, they need to go to the gym, they would probably have a whole bunch of issues. Like I don't know how to use the weight machines, and I don't know how to, right? Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that they just don't know. And I imagine with anxiety, like mentally, there's probably a whole lot of things we don't know about. Like how do I change my thoughts? How do I change my beliefs? So where would I start with that?
First of all, you have to first identify what the issue is, right? Like if you were going to go to the gym and say, I want to work on my body, the first port of call would be to meet with a personal trainer, and then they would assess what are your goals? Like, what do you want to do? Losing weight versus building muscle are going to require two very different exercise regimes. So, similarly, if you want to identify, if you want to get hold of your mind and you want to change things, you want to change your anxiety, we first got to go in there and identify, well, what is it that's happening? Is it the what ifing that's going on, that this persistent worry about outcomes? Or is it that I'm afraid of my anxiety? Or is it that I work myself to the bone 60 hours a week and I don't give myself any time out? Is it a core belief that's driving it? We first got to identify what that is. The way that you do that is by becoming more aware of self. People do not ever stop and ask themselves, what am I thinking in this moment? So just start there, is just asking yourself, what am I saying to myself? What am I thinking? You don't actually have to change anything just then, but just becoming more aware of it already begins a process in which it starts to change. Because a lot of what you're thinking and telling yourself is, by and large, subconscious. It's, in other words, it's outside of your consciousness because you're not paying attention to it. But the minute you bring it into your attention, it can't stay the same. It can't stay the same. Because, for example, one of the biggest things that drive anxiety is ourselves berating ourselves. So the feeling of, if I don't get it right, then I'm stupid or I'm silly or I'm pathetic. I'm a burden to people if I keep asking for reassurance. These are some of the things that people might say when they're anxious, right? When you stop to realize that that's what you're telling yourself, it's really difficult to continue saying that like knowingly, right? It is a subconscious thing. But when you imagine saying this to somebody else, your friend, your partner, it's like, whoa, this is pretty harsh. So now, am I going to sit here and continue telling myself that I'm stupid? Maybe some people will, right? And then we need to do a bit more work. But ideally, as you bring it into your conscious mind, you now have it there to change, because when it's in the subconscious, you don't know what it is. So your first port of call, just to I've gone on a bit of a long-winded answer here, but the first port of call would be just ask yourself in any given moment, what am I thinking right now? What am I telling myself? And begin noting that down. That's going to give you a clue to what it is that you need to work on next, and what beliefs or what thoughts, perpetual thoughts, you might need to change.
Gotcha. So it all starts with self-awareness and really self-reflecting and paying attention to in the moment instead of being so focused on, oh my God, I'm anxious, I can't deal with this, of, well, what is that thought? Like I'm having the thought, I'm so anxious, I can't deal with this. And maybe that's the thing that I need to work on is that thought pattern, or that way of talking to myself.
Yeah.
So is it really just about changing our self-talk and the way we talk to ourselves?
That's a huge, huge, powerful strategy. And people like roll their eyes when you say improve your self talk and you'll improve your life. But hands down, absolutely, you will. Absolutely. 80% of what you're telling yourself, you're not even aware of. But it's that stuff that's driving how you feel, how motivated you are, what you're doing, your relationships, all of it is being told, is being depicted by the self talk that you have in the background.
Gotcha. So it sounds like being aware of the self-talk and bringing that into from our subconscious into our conscious awareness by reflecting on it gives us more clues on what to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then you can begin changing it.
Hmm. Gotcha. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that just the awareness alone create begins to create the change. Is there more I have to do, or is it like I'm just as soon as I'm aware of it, I'm going to be able to figure it out?
It begins the change, and in many places it might start the process of it changing in and of itself. The next step ideally is to ask yourself, if you had somebody in exactly the same position as you right now, like your friend, your partner, your child even, would you say these same things to them? 9 out of 10 times, actually 10 out of 10 times, people are going to say, no ways would I ever say this to somebody I love.
Right. Right. Yeah, like I would never say, "Oh my God, if you don't get this, if your mic doesn't work in that meeting, like you're totally gonna fail." And like you're like that'd be like absurd. You would never say that to someone you love and care about, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Like
Yeah.
I wouldn't send my daughter to school and say, you better have the best day ever, because if you don't, that's it for you. You're awful. You would have failed everything. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Wow. That's pretty deep.
Powerful.
So so I'm so curious then, like how did we get here? Like why do we talk to ourselves in a way that we wouldn't talk to our daughters, husbands, wives, spouses, partners, friends, and family?
Oh, Tom, you're going deep today. Okay. So basically, where this comes from is from the way that I like to describe it is that as human beings, we have two essential things that we're striving for. The first is to find love and acceptance, and the second is to avoid feeling like crap. That's it. And so, literally, from the minute we are born, we are taking in information from our environment to tell us what we need to do to be lovable and acceptable, and what we need to do to avoid feeling like crap. And so it's going to largely depend on the environment that you're born into and the situations that you find yourself in as you grow up, what that information is going to be, right? We're learning from our caregivers that potentially when, if we've got working parents and then we come in and we're like, oh, I'm hungry, can I have a sandwich? And then the parents are tired and they roll their eyes and they're like, oh, can you not just make the sandwich yourself? So they get up and make the sandwich, but it's made us feel bad about asking for the sandwich, right? So now we've stored, okay, they don't love me that much when I ask for a sandwich. Then on Saturday morning, you come in with a cup of tea for your mum, and she's like, wow, you're so amazing. Thank you so much. And we're like, okay, when I meet her needs, she loves me. So now we're slowly starting to build a belief that says, I shouldn't ask for help. And I definitely should make sure that other people get their needs met because that makes me most lovable and most acceptable. So, this is just a really crude example of how these beliefs are being formed, right? So now what ends up happening is we're also creating a part of self that's going to berate us when we're not doing the right thing. Sometimes it's internalizing some of the like admonishments that you got from your parents, because of course, any time that your parents or your caregivers are angry with you or they berate you or they punish you, that gets stored as a very hurtful thing. And of course, something that we don't want to repeat, because remember, we want to avoid feeling like crap and we also want to be lovable and acceptable. So that kind of being berated or being shouted at is not meeting those things. I feel like crap and I'm also not lovable. So we store that as something we should never repeat. Now we internalize that voice, we internalize what that means, and we make it stronger to make sure that we never do this again. So these are where we kind of begin to form these, I guess, parameters of behavior. And then we have this internal critic that is formed in order to protect us, ironically, and to try to keep us in line so that we are lovable and acceptable and avoid feeling like crap. But it gets out of hand, right? Because you would not talk to your children or your loved ones that way.
Gotcha. So it sounds like we create this part of ourselves, you're saying, like that we like this inner critic, this
Yeah.
voice inside of our head, and its goal is to help us feel loved and accepted by other people and to avoid feeling bad.
Yeah.
And then kind of that part of us kind of grows up as we do as a kid or as a teenager in whatever environment or home or family or community that you grew up in, and it learns all these lessons. And it sounds like when I'm 40, I still have this like 8-year-old kid in my head who's kind of living the same way, and that's the inner critic, is that kind of younger part of ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess it's in those moments when you're doing something that makes you feel slightly vulnerable, which then triggers that part of self, that inner child, and that feels vulnerable. And so then your inner critic comes up and goes, "Yes, you see, you shouldn't have done it that way. You should do it this way. Don't be stupid, etc." So we're berating self because we don't want to feel vulnerable. So figure it out. Make yourself in a better way so that you don't feel this vulnerability. It's basically what it comes down to. So yes, absolutely. In any given moment, you have got two, if not more, parts of self that are operating. Two really important parts. The one being your inner child, which is, that very sort of basic part of self that's just desperate for love and acceptance. And then you've got the inner critic that's coming in to like regulate the behavior, if you will.
Gotcha. So it sounds like there's a lot going on, which is maybe why we have so many thoughts and so many worries and concerns and things going on in there.
100%. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we simplify? Like, how do you find inner peace? Is it like, I mean, do we just go sit on a mountain and meditate and then, problems go away or?
Well, I believe that if we knew the answer to finding inner peace, there would be a whole lot more people having inner peace. Yeah. But we can start with just being kinder to ourselves, learning a bit more self-compassion. You know, it's about recognizing as an adult that those things that felt so painful when you were little didn't actually mean that you were not lovable and not acceptable. They didn't mean that. Your parents were angry because they were frustrated or the behavior wasn't fabulous, but not once did they think you were not lovable or unacceptable. In some cases, potentially because we have parents that really shouldn't be parents, right? But I'm talking for the vast majority of us that are growing up in relatively good homes where parents are doing the very best that they can. We're all coming out of we're I guess no one is coming out of childhood unscathed, regardless of what your background is. And that's largely because as a child, you perceive those things so much bigger and so much more of a threat to your life and your existence than when you're an adult. And it makes sense, right? Because if your parents were to disapprove of you or chuck you out when you're really, really young, you wouldn't survive. So your brain knows that. And so when they are unhappy with you or when they are presenting in a way that you feel like, oh my gosh, they don't accept me, that does get stored as a threat to your survival. But as an adult, it's not true. And it never was true, right? You would have survived and you are lovable and acceptable, regardless of the naughty things that you did or the things that you got wrong or the mistakes that you made. But now it's about kind of undoing those beliefs that were created in the first place. And we start right at the beginning with self compassion. So if we're looking for one easy, quick strategy, figure out what it is that you're saying to yourself. Ask if you would say that to somebody else. And if the answer is no, then ask yourself what you would say to that person and then say that to yourself instead. That's it.
Wow, that's really deep. Hmm. So as you're saying all that, what I was realizing in my head is it's almost like there's miscommunication, right? So like as a child, we were in the situation, and our brain interpreted it in a certain way to try to protect us. And then now as an adult, we can look back at the situation and say, oh, hey, actually, like I wasn't seeing things clearly. Like I misinterpreted my parents' behavior or their response, and
Yeah.
so now I can address that in a different way.
Yeah.
But it almost sounds like what you're saying though is like maybe we don't. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. Do we need to go back and kind of unpack all our childhood trauma and all those experiences, or is it more about what you were just saying of just be like, oh, in this moment, just noticing I'm saying mean things to myself, and what would I say to a friend, and say that instead? Is it a little bit of both, or?
I guess it depends, right? Like we've got such a varied backgrounds. People are coming from various experiences, some that were really traumatizing, whereas some were not. So if we're coming from a really traumatic background, potentially, yeah, we need to go back and unpack that really just from the perspective not to relive the trauma or tell somebody what you went through, but rather to go back and look at that child experience and then reframe that from an adult perspective that says, actually, you are safe now. And what you believed about yourself as a result of those experiences isn't actually true. And you don't have to hold on to that anymore. The stuff that those parents did or the behaviors that they displayed had more to do about them and the stuff that was going on for them than it ever had to do with you as a child. Yet you took that on. So that's coming from a traumatic background. But it's on a continuum, right? From really extreme to really healthy. So depending on where you are in that continuum, that's going to decide how much work you need to do in the past. If we're coming from relatively good backgrounds and it's really just a case of we're trying to regulate our own behavior in a really stringent way, then simply becoming aware of what you're saying to yourself and changing that inner self-talk is going to be enough and really powerful.
Gotcha. And so is that the gift of anxiety then? Is that it alerts us to our self-talk? It alerts us to the ways in which we kind of talk to ourselves or relate to ourselves or relate to our boss or our environment or our family in ways that are not serving us?
Yeah, absolutely. So so there are these four main reasons for anxiety to pop up, right? The first is that a core belief has been triggered. And so that's when a daily event has triggered something that you believe about yourself. So, for example, if I'm stuck in a situation where my husband is away for months and I have to take care of my kids on my own, and now I'm living in New Zealand and I don't have any family to support me, and I've got to ask somebody for help. So I've got to ask a friend to maybe pick up my kids from school because I've got a late meeting. And now I start to feel anxious. then I can ask myself, well, what is it that I'm anxious about? Oh, I'm anxious about asking for this help. Why? Because I have a core belief that says I shouldn't ask people for help. I'm unacceptable when I do that. So I'm going back to that first example of how those core beliefs get created, right? So now all of a sudden, I'm alerted to the fact that there's a core belief here that says I'm not allowed to ask other people for help because if I do, I'm unacceptable. Is that even serving me? It doesn't, because everybody needs help and it is 100% acceptable to ask for support. So now I begin to shift that belief or do some work on it, right? It's not just going to change like that, but the mere fact that I'm aware of why I'm feeling anxious means that that anxiety isn't going to turn into stuck anxiety about itself. So that's really where we want to land with that. In other instances, you might find that the event is actually triggering a past trauma. So there might be something about what is happening now. Maybe it's a confrontation with a friend or a partner, and suddenly it takes you back to a traumatic event when you were little. Your brain is always going to store those earlier traumatic events as things that must never, ever be repeated again. So anytime something in your daily life now, in the current, starts to look familiar or it feels familiar, maybe it's a tone of voice, or maybe it's particular words that were said in that confrontation, or maybe it's just even the time of the day and the music that's playing in the background. It can be anything that your brain has stored. And it goes, oh, wow, this is similar. We need to get away from the situation. It's going to bring anxiety. So again, it's about identifying in that moment, why am I suddenly feeling so anxious? Oh, I feel really unsafe. Why do I feel unsafe? What does it remind me of? Oh, it reminds me of this time when this happened. Again, it's not always that easy to just do it in the moment. But potentially, if we're coming from traumatic backgrounds, ideally we have a therapist or somebody that can guide us through that and work with us. So then that awareness can become a bit better. The third reason why anxiety comes up is often because we're just stretched thin. So either we're working too hard, our challenges are too high, we don't have the resources to meet the requests that are being made of us, or we have sort of physical deficiencies. So anything that's stressing your system. And at that time, like people get high anxiety when the iron is really low. Well, iron is the thing that brings oxygen to your blood cells, right? So if you don't have iron, then you don't have enough oxygen in your cells. So of course your anxiety is going to be high. I mean, this is again like a psychological way of looking at it. There are other biological things that happen when you have low iron that results in anxiety. But it's a good way of understanding that even with just physiological things that are going on in your body, if there's anxiety, is asking you to pay attention to that. Maybe you need to just not work 60 hours, and maybe we do need to prioritize self. So these are the reasons that anxiety pops up. And anytime that that happens, if we can just sit still with that and ask, what is this about? What is happening here that's not serving me? That's when anxiety becomes a gift, right? Because now it's helping you to identify the areas of your life that really are coming from, early experiences that are not true, inner self-talk that is harmful, or beliefs that we need to shift because they're old and outdated. It could be a wide variety of things.
Gotcha. So anxiety is this alert system telling us we need to do something and there's some kind of problem to solve. And I think that's really easy to see when it's like, oh, I have a meeting tomorrow. I need to like prepare my presentation, right?
Yeah.
Like that's just so simple to see. And it sounds like what you're saying is it can feel more complex than that in a case where maybe we're just in a stressful life situation and we're working too hard, or we have, maybe we have a challenging relationship at home or at work, and we're trying to struggle through navigating how to do that. And instead of blaming the anxiety and our stress that we're feeling, we can use that as kind of a guide to reflect and to think about the situation and to figure out an action plan that will actually take us from where we are to a place that we more want to be.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's important is that if if you haven't come to the point at which you're struggling with stuck anxiety, in other words, you haven't necessarily been given the diagnosis of an anxiety disorder, then it's a really good place to start is becoming aware of the fact that anxiety is an alarm. Ask yourself what it's asking you to pay attention to. If we've already kind of gone through the phases of becoming stuck, well, the first bit of work that we have to do there is undo the fear of anxiety itself. And then we can go back to that space where anytime anxiety pops up, we can ask ourselves, what is this about? But when we're still really afraid of anxiety and that stuck space, it's going to be really difficult to see these original alarms, right? We first got to get rid of the fear.
Okay. So how do we get rid of the fear?
Yeah, so that's where the ease method comes in, right? So this is about understanding how anxiety works, how it functions in your body, what are the alarm systems that it's using, so the symptoms that it's giving you, and then starting to put together a little bit of your history, like identify that there've been some things that have happened in your past, or maybe you have a family history of anxiety. So there's lots of ways in which we can identify how likely it is that we could get stuck with anxiety. And when you have a better understanding of what that could be, then we stop thinking, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with me and I'm just damaged goods. And we go, the anxiety is making a bit more sense, right? Then we want to really be able to lean in and accept the anxiety. So there are different ways of just allowing anxiety to be, but ideally we want to just see it as an emotional response that will subside, like it will. And sometimes we have to address some of the beliefs we have about anxiety, this idea that it is an illness, that it says something about you, that you're broken if you're experiencing it, the idea that it can kill you or harm you, or that it can make you go crazy. These are beliefs that people hold about anxiety that perpetuates the fear of it. But as they begin to remove those beliefs and change how they see anxiety, then they can respond in a better way. And once we're able to just let it be, we want to take our eye off it. We don't want to be focusing, how many symptoms am I experiencing today? How is my anxiety? Is it better? Is it worse? I've done this meditation. How did it work? Is my anxiety gone away yet? If we're consistently focusing on it, then it's going to be the thing that you see and consistently experience. So shifting that focus is really important. And then lastly, when you kind of get back into living your life and being more present, the best times of our life is when we're fully immersed in whatever it is that's happening for us, right? Most people will say that when they're in that space, just being present, engaged, doing what it is that they're doing, they hardly notice that they're anxious at all. So many people will say they need to get busy so that they can distract themselves from their anxiety. I wanted to change. I want you to think about the fact that anxiety is distracting you from living your life. Being present and engaged is your natural state. So the more of that you can do, the more confidence you're going to build in your ability to have anxiety-free moments and stop worrying about it so much. So that's kind of the ease approach, right? Empower, accept, shift, and engage.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah, I think so often we do talk about that, like we want to find a distraction. Maybe like why we have addictions, or we spend so much time on our phones or social media because we feel uncomfortable and we just like want something to like zone out into, right?
Yeah.
And it sounds like what you're saying is like it's actually the opposite. It's like what we really want is we want to be engaged and present with our family, or playing sports or in our work or doing meaningful things in our lives. And the anxiety is actually distracting us from that, right?
Absolutely.
Um, but anxiety is also this gift too, where it's like it sounds like there's a part of anxiety that is there to help us. But there's a part of anxiety that's maybe like the inner child part that's like not as educated, or acting in way it's like acting out. It's like a little kid acting out, having a temper tantrum, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so it's almost sounds like what you're saying is we have to work on our self-talk and our relationship with ourselves. We also have to work on our relationship with our anxiety and how we kind of navigate um those emotions that come up, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I love that you've mentioned that, because I often say to my clients that it's really helpful to imagine that anxiety is a tiny little child that is just desperately afraid that you or it is going to die. So then how would you manage a little child that's like kind of tugging at your arm and desperate for you, keep them safe? I mean, children don't necessarily calm down when we tell them to shut up and go away, or if we pick up our phone and start scrolling so that we can just like ignore them, right? That's not going to help. But generally, when you pick up that child, put them on your lap, listen to what they've got to say, give them a big cuddle, and then tell them the truth of the situation, or rationalize with them, or help them work through what it is that they're afraid of, that's when they calm down. So if we could just do the same with our anxiety, you're going to win.
Gotcha. So it's almost like parenting yourself, or parenting your anxiety, or parenting this part of you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, that's really beautiful. Um, was there anything else you want to share before we go? Is there anything else that you think people really need to know in order to, take back control in this area of their life?
Yeah, I think really at the very core of what I'm trying to share with everyone, and what I share with my clients, is that we've kind of been led to believe that normal is like robotic not feeling. We've come into the society where if you don't sleep enough, then you get given a tablet. If you sleep too much, you get given a tablet. If you are too happy, you get given a tablet. If you're too angry, you get given a tablet. Too anxious, get given a tablet. So we're trying to take what is our normal experiences of going up and down, quite big experiences, and we're saying, oh no, it's too much of that, too much of that, let's just narrow it down, narrow it down, narrow it down. And we're getting into this very narrow band of experience that we're now deeming to be normal. And so anytime somebody then flicks out of that tiny little band, then we look at that and go, oh, that's a problem, when in reality it is our natural state to feel things. And as happy as and excited as we want to be about things, we can expect to feel as sad and as raw and as anxious about things too. It's about accepting all of those emotional responses and recognizing that we are raw, messy human beings, and that is normal, not robotic androids, right?
Gotcha. So it's really about understanding that our emotions will get big, like we will get really angry, or we will get really scared, or we'll panic about something and then realize, oh, maybe I overreacted.
Yeah.
And that maybe if we realize, oh, I have this pattern of overreacting, maybe instead of saying, oh, I'm such a loser, or I'm such a like I'm so broken, I need drugs, or I need there's something wrong with me, I'm defective. Instead of having all those negative thoughts in our mind, we can say, oh, you know what, actually, that's totally okay. It's normal to panic sometimes. I just, I was feeling really stressed out, and like kind of talking to yourself the way you would talk to a friend if they freaked out about something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And those emotional responses are always alerting you to something, right? So if you're always angry, then it's obviously that we're feeling like there's an injustice in our lives, or we're not validated, or we're not heard. So let's address that. If you're always in a state of joy and happiness, well, then life is going pretty well, because your emotional responses are there to alert you to things that are not working for you or needs that are not being met. So it is 100% okay to feel them, and then we need to address them and accept them.
Gotcha. So, but I'm guessing a lot of people though will really struggle with accepting that, right? Because maybe we've been told, I feel like so often in our society that, there's certain things that are not acceptable, right? Like you're not allowed to get that angry. You're not allowed to cry like that, or it's like we get so many messages. Like you tell kids, like shut up, stop crying, do this. Like there's just so many messages that we get about our emotional experiences from the time we're very young. And you see it on TV, you see it in the media, you see it all the time. So how do I know that you're right and that that's okay to feel this big, you know what I mean? Like how do we come to terms with that each for ourselves?
You can test it out. You can test it out for yourself, right? Anytime that you feel something that you would deem to be negative, if you are angry with yourself, or you're upset with yourself, or you're anxious with yourself for feeling that way, just notice how long that feeling takes to go away, right? Versus, and then try it out another time when you feel that thing, just allow yourself to feel it. Say, this is okay. I'm allowed to feel this. And then notice how quickly it goes away. You can put it to the test for yourself, and the evidence is in there.
Gotcha. So what you're saying is try it out, see if this whole accepting yourself and talking to yourself kind of works,
Yeah,
and see if kind of continuing with whatever habits or patterns that you have already, see if that's working better for you.
exactly right. Yeah.
So kind of like be the scientist of your own life and try to like do your own little experiments and see what works better for you.
Yeah. Well, 100% you are the expert on you. End of story. There is nobody else that can tell you how you are, who you are, what you've experienced more than you can. So test it and then see what happens.
Yeah, that's great. I love that message. Yeah. Thank you so much, Di. There's just so much wisdom you shared in this interview. Like there's so many more questions I have to ask you, but we don't have time for it. But it's really, really amazing information, and I'm so proud of you and the work that you're doing
Thank you.
and the book. And so maybe you can tell more people a little bit really quickly about the book and where they can get it.
Yeah, so the book is The Gift of Anxiety, and it really is walking you through the process of the EASE method to help you to change that response to anxiety, change the way that you see it, and then allow you to use anxiety as an emotional response that can serve you. It is available on Amazon and all online bookstores. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. And what about a website or social media? Like where if
Oh,
we
of
want to
course.
follow you
Yes.
to get more D, that this interview wasn't enough, they want more, where do they go?
Amazing. Thank you. Yes, my website is theunstuckinitiative.com, all one word. And you can find me on Instagram at the.unstuck.initiative. I'm mostly on Instagram and TikTok, same handle. And you can find all of the information on my website, theunstuckinitiative.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, D.
Yeah, thank you so much.